Good afternoon, everyone. And before I start, I would like to congratulate all women, not only in mining, but everywhere for today, the International Women's Day. Thank you very much for joining us here today. I am Carolina Albernas, CEO of the Brazil-Canada Chamber of Commerce, and I will be your MC today for our next session, Brazil-Canada ESG Insights. So before I start, I would like to thank our sponsors and our partners for the support. Without you, we wouldn't be able to put together this event today. So thank you. We have a packed agenda today, focused on one of our favorite subjects, ESG and sustainability. With the support from Proachiva and Sescon Barrier, we present today 3 incredible panels to discuss a variety of trending topics from business and human rights to ESG reporting, trends and regulations, as well as the ESG commitments, carbon footprint, and biodiversity. We've invited 16 amazing women to discuss how they're supporting their companies to implement different strategies and programs on ESG. For the past 4 years, we have been organizing during PDAC a series of discussions focused on ESG strategies, sustainability issues in a very structured manner. And aiming to bring the subject to the forefront, we held several events, not only during PDAC, but throughout the years as well, including the participation of recognized experts and leaders from many companies, members and non-members associations and institutions, with always the objective of leverage their experience and the tradition and relevance of Brazil and Canada in the sustainability space and translate this expertise into a bilateral international case. With ESG now in front and center and a mandatory discussion in boardrooms and management meetings for companies and investors, not only in Brazil and Canada, but all over the world, we're very excited to bring together this agenda to discuss this topic a little bit further. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dulce Medal Benke, Director of Sustainable Finance at Proachiva, to say a few words in the opening remarks. So Dulce, with you.
Thank you, Carolina. Good afternoon to all. Good afternoon to my colleagues in the panel. Good afternoon to the audience here with us today. First, I'd like to thank the Brazilian-Canada Chamber of Commerce for the invitation to deliver these opening remarks at the Brazil-Canada ESG Insights. I'm really delighted to be part of this event to discuss the global trends in the ESG agenda. I think we could not be in the better moment for this discussion and could not put together a better group of specialists to bring to us the developments, challenges, and the future of this strategic agenda for companies, society, and sustainable development. Proachiva has been working in partnership with BCCC to unveil the challenges and opportunities of sustainability and ESG agenda to business. This is the 4th edition of the sustainability events by BCCC that Proachiva has been helping to conceive and frame since inception. This year, our event will coincide, or maybe not coincide, with the International Women's Day, and therefore we have structured our panels to be 100% composed of brilliant women. A little retrospective. The first event that we did together was in 2019 and addressed risks and crisis management and had the participation of important leaders in this area, including the World Bank, IFC, IBRAM, ICMM, and others. The next event, the following events, EDC, BMO, IFC, Kinross, and Vale addressed the status quo of the ESG for sustainable finance in mining. End of last year, we had the opportunity to hear from practitioners and their perspectives on the implementation of the ESG agenda. Today, in this event, at the Brazil-Canada ESG Insights, we bring to attention the most critical ESG issues and their trends. Last year, we were warned that climate risk is an investment risk at the World Economic Forum. This year, in 2021, ESG issues, especially climate, goes beyond risk management and highlights an initiated revolution, where the pricing of climate risk generates a tectonic movement of capital reallocation. As Larry Fink mentions in his letter, it's the beginning of a long transition, but one that must accelerate rapidly. In the Sustainable Bonds Insights that was launched 2 weeks ago, the head of Sustainable Bonds and Finance at DZ Bank forecasts that the new issuance volume of green bonds will increase by 30% to $350 billion in 2021. And in about 2 to 3 years, the annual issuance is expected to approach $1 trillion mark. Also, in 2020, we observed an increasing demand for social bonds that saw a 75-fold increase due to the impact of the pandemic. Another important data, there were 40 trillion in ESG mandated funds in 2020, and allocation of $150 trillion is expected by the end of 2030. All this means we are entering a new era with criteria and parameterized performance in environmental, social, and governance. And this is what we are dealing with in these events of the Chamber. For today, we chose 3 thematic umbrellas, as Carolina already said. The first panel is going to talk about business and human rights. The second panel, we are going to talk about ESG reporting, regulations, and trends. And the last panel, ESG commitments, carbon footprint, and biodiversity. Talking a little bit about the first panel, the human rights agenda. It's been 10 years since the launch of the UN Guiding Principles, and companies and people still confuse the public dimension of human rights with the agenda of the company's relationship with human rights. The agenda of business and human rights offers a more modern vision and offers to companies the opportunity to understand its impacts in all aspects that affect society, bring giant potential of sustainability to the territory in which it is operating. For this panel, we invited Simone Rocha to moderate and update us from these 10 years of the UN Guiding Principles. In the second panel, we want to highlight how these big commitments that we are hearing about are being a landmark for paving concrete action plans that will lead economies around the world to a carbon neutralization. A number of companies and investors are seeking to address these dimensions, mobilized by a series of international initiatives, regulation, stakeholders' pressure, and business interests. For this panel, for our second panel, we invite Fernanda Montofarno to not only provoke the issue of carbon neutralization and how commitments have been made and reported, but also the new wave of transparency that begins to bring light to other elements related to nature, including biodiversity, ecosystem services, environmental services, and the value of natural capital. In our last panel, we could not avoid the theme that everyone is looking at, that is carbon, which has been the spearhead and a lever for us to improve all our commitments related to sustainability. This is the topic mobilizing a revolution, how governments, society, corporations, and investors are strategizing not only the response to climate change, but also the risk management and response to many other ESG topics. For our third panel, we have Rebecca Stefanini Pavlovsky as a moderator to explore together with panelists the transformational angle propelled by climate, carbon, energy transition, and moving beyond. Well, as you can see, this afternoon we are going to bring light to the most relevant issues that are shaping the ESG agenda, and not globally. And I really expect that we can not only be together this afternoon, but we can continue working together along our journeys. I think I'll stop now and I'll leave the floor for this group of amazing women, wishing you all a very fruitful discussion. Enjoy and thank you again.
Thank you, Dulcie. Thank you for the opening remarks and for this retrospective. It's been such a pleasure working with Proachiva throughout these years in putting together this very positive agenda. So without further ado, let's hear from the experts. So I'd like to welcome Simone, Lizo, Natalie, and Raquel to join us right now to start this discussion on business and human rights. Simone, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon. So I'm Simone Rocha. I am a practitioner on business and human rights. I do due diligence. I work also at the Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro, and I am a Latin American advisor for the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights, GBI, that some of you may know. So it's a pleasure to be with you all here this afternoon. And I join Carolina in congratulating all women here today, the ones in the panel, the ones watching us. And I'd like to start by thanking the Brazil-Canada Chamber of Commerce for inviting me to mediate this discussion, a very timely one, business and human rights, the impact of the new EU regulations for your company. I have the privilege and the honor to be accompanied today by some leading practitioners in business and human rights. I'll go ahead and introduce them to you in the order they will be speaking. So Raquel Althoff, our first speaker, is a lead consultant at Luning Human Rights and Responsible Business and a senior advisor in Proachiva Results. As a consultant, Raquel has experience in supporting companies to implement human rights due diligence in projects in Europe and Latin America in sectors such as mining and metals, agriculture, retail, textile, insurance, and utilities. She has worked for a major extractive company for 10 years, where she acquired relevant expertise on the integration of human rights into risk and other management processes. She also acted as the ethical trade senior manager for Europe's leading online fashion platform, being responsible for supply chain compliance on social and labor conditions in factories in 27 countries. Raquel will guide us through normative developments in the business and human rights agenda in this 10 years since the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles. She'll focus on the European countries and European Union. So moving to our second presentation, Lizo Filgueiras is the Human Rights and Sustainability General Manager at Vale. Lizo is one of the pioneers on the business and human rights agenda in Brazil. She has been working at Vale for 15 years. She joined Vale Foundation in 2005, and in 2007, the sustainability area. She has been responsible for Vale's human rights agenda since 2009. She managed the Indigenous Community Relations portfolio, the socioeconomic area, and Vale Corporate Volunteers Program for 6 years. She was one of the first corporate managers to design a human rights due diligence process in Brazil. She is also largely experienced in international business and human rights forums, both as a participant and as a speaker. Lizo will share with us Vale's experience on human rights due diligence implementation, focusing on the UN Guiding Principles micro-processes. She will also provide a practitioner's perspective over normative developments. Moving on to our third speaker, Natalie Lauriano is the human rights specialist at Braskem. Natalie has professional experience in a variety of human rights issues, such as business and human rights, public policy, non-discrimination, affirmative action, diversity and inclusion, and many others. At Braskem, she's responsible for the global implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Before joining Braskem, she worked at Natura Cosmetics and the Brazilian federal government. She was a consultant at international organizations such as the World Bank Group, the Organization of American States, and United Nations agencies. From Natalie, we'll hear about Braskem's experience in UN Guiding Principles implementation, with focus on risk prioritization and leadership implication. So, as you can see, we'll have firsthand analytical and empirical contributions to help us understand the developments of the business and human rights agenda since the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles in 2011. In these 10 years, states and corporations have been undertaking efforts to turn these principles of the protect, respect, and remedy framework into reality. Reality in projects, in daily operations, in value chains, and last but not least, in rights holders' lives. As states and companies face growing expectations in regard to protecting and respecting human rights in corporate activities, investors, non-governmental organizations, and intergovernmental organizations such as the European Union have become critical actors in requesting the uptake of human rights due diligence practices. What we see now is that these expectations are moving beyond voluntary measures and best practices guidelines and starting to turn into mandatory norms, into binding national and international legislation. Two important examples are the international treaty in discussion in the UN Human Rights Council since 2014 and the European Union Mandatory Due Diligence Directive expected for this year and of which we'll be speaking this afternoon. Today, our aim is to get you more acquainted with the developments that have been taking place in these 10 years since the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles, in particular in regards to two aspects: the growth of normative requests for corporate compliance to human rights, and secondly, how large multinationals have been dealing with these increasing demands. To initiate this conversation this afternoon, Raquel will then guide us through these normative developments, whereas Liesl from Valley and Natalie from Braskem will provide first-hand account on how human rights due diligence and other aspects of the UN Guiding Principles have been internalized by companies. So with no further ado, I hand the floor to Raquel, reminding all panelists that you have 7 minutes each. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simone. I'm going to share the screen now. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. So in the next 7 minutes, I'll share some insights regarding some key regulations in the European Union. So I will present a quick overview of some specific European regulations, and then I will share a bit about national context in the EU. And finally, I'll explain why I believe that these regulations may change things not only in Europe, but also in other continents throughout global value chains. I'd like to start by highlighting that after 10 years of the UN Guiding Principles, we can finally see human rights due diligence becoming mandatory in Europe. It's important to highlight that the Guiding Principles continue to be the main inspiration for these regulations, and that companies that already have a robust human rights due diligence aligned with the principles will certainly be in greater shape to comply with existing and upcoming regulations. As you can see in the slide, regulations have been developed not only at the EU level, but also at the national level. It's important to notice that many of these regulations are already in force. Still, there's an expectation, as Simone was mentioning, for a new EU directive on the topic, as you can see on the right side of the slide. So we'll go quickly through the regulations that are here listed and that already exist, and then I'm going to explain the reason why this new directive has been strongly supported by several actors. So let me quickly go through what's already in place. So the first two regulations on the left relate to reporting requirements on sustainability, including human rights. The first one poses requirements to large companies, and the second one focuses on financial actors such as banks and investment companies. The regulation on conflict minerals requires EU importers of tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, the 3TG, to carry out the diligence on their supply chain. And finally, we have the EU Taxonomy, which establishes a common framework for identifying a sustainable economic activity. And here it's important to highlight that the framework has the compliance with minimum social safeguards as one of its criteria, and that it explicitly mentions alignment to the UN guiding principles. So under this regulation, those who offer financial products will have to disclose whether these are in line with the taxonomy, and companies will have to disclose whether their activities are in line with the taxonomy. So the question is, if so many recent regulations are already in place, why is a new one under discussion? Well, first of all, we observe that some of these regulations, they're focused on requiring reporting from companies. And there's an understanding that this might not be an incentive strong enough for companies to really adopt an adequate due diligence process. We also noticed that some initiatives are more focused on specific sectors and issues, such as the conflict minerals regulation. Therefore, the idea of having a mandatory due diligence is very welcome by diverse actors. These include companies acting in different countries in Europe that would rather have an EU-wide guidance instead of having to comply with different national legislation. This potential new directive aims at being cross-sector and is expected to be soon proposed by the European Commission. Once the Commission submits its proposal, it will be considered and voted by the European Parliament and the European Council. If adopted, the legislation should take place as a directive. And in this case, member states must transpose the directive into national law with a deadline of 2 years. Well, when it comes to the national context in Europe, we can observe that most national governments have adopted a national action plan to implement the UN guiding principles. These are the countries in light blue in the map. Most important are, of course, the national laws in place in the UK, France, and the Netherlands, as well as the upcoming law in Germany. And this brings me to my final slide on the relevance of these regulations to companies worldwide. Well, we believe that these regulations may not only inspire other countries and continents to move on with their own laws on mandatory human rights due diligence. Actually, our main point is that these requirements will surely be cascaded to investee companies by investors and to supply chains by their companies everywhere. Therefore, it is expected that mandatory due diligence in Europe will have an impact in several businesses around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Raquel. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would just like to highlight one or two points that you mentioned that I think the audience should remember. The first important point that you mentioned is that the companies that have been already trying to comply with the UN guiding principles, or to better saying, to adopt its practices to the UN guiding principles, in particular to the instauration of the diligence processes, that these companies will be better off once we have mandatory regulations in place. I think this is a very important point of the path that we're in. If we could say one thing about this 10 years of the guiding principles, that they have really paved the way for compliance. So whenever legislations become reality, companies that have taken this path are, as I just said, probably better off in complying to the norms or to the legislations. And the other point that you mentioned that I find really important to retain is the fact that supply chain is, as we know, one of the most important topics in business and human rights. And supply chain has been showing, either directly or indirectly, in different legislations that are already in place in Europe mainly. And it is for sure going to be the case in the European normative once it's published. It's not a secret. It's been in the drafts and everything from the Parliament. So we could expect that, as you said, there will be a spillover effect from Europe to other regions in the world and to other companies in the world, because of the demands applied in Europe in regards to the European companies' value chains. So now I would like to move on to Liso Filgueiras to share with us her very vast, broad, and rich experience working with business and human rights since 2009 in Vale. Lizo, please.
Thank you very much. I don't know, Simone, if you can project my slides, but if not, it's just 3 and I can go through the topics because we have a short time. So I'll start, well, good morning and afternoon to all and happy Women's Day. It is an honor to be here at PDAC on a roundtable about the 10 years of UNGPs and the update of the European due diligence legislation derived from it and under discussion and advancing as we speak with peers and friends I admire so much. Just to bring some highlights about Vale for those who do not know it, Vale is among the largest mining companies in the world with more than 250,000 shareholders on all continents, a market capital of $88.5 billion. The company is one of the world's largest producers of iron ore and iron pellets and nickel. It operates in large logistics systems in Brazil and other regions of the world, including railroads, maritime terminals, and ports integrated with its mining operations. And in Brazil, the company employs more than 75% of its total workforce of approximately 185,000 people, including its own employees and contractors. So around 74,000 own employees and 111,000 contractors. It has been a long 10 years since Vale first approved its global human rights policy in 2009. It was based on the Protect, Respect, and Remedy framework. Since then, the policy went through 2 revisions, one in 2014 to align with the UNGPs and another in 2019 after Brumadinho tragedy, when we did a public consultation and were able to include 97% of recommendations. The policy is always approved at board level and it must be implemented globally in our operations and activities. After reviewing the policy in 2014, Vale aligned its human rights management to the UNGP's macro processes, as Simone mentioned. So we follow the policy commitment and integration, risk and impact assessment, grievance mechanisms and whistleblowing, remediation processes, and of course, the Samarco tragedy and Brumadinho tragedy are at the top of that, but day-to-day impact management also falls into this category. Monitoring of all action plans of the risk assessments and impact assessments, and due diligence, grievance mechanisms, as I mentioned, reporting results and actions, and salient issues, stakeholders, and partnerships. So we are organized by this macro processes, those 7 micro processes. I'll not be able to cover them all. I only have 7 minutes, but let me highlight some aspects of them. As a follow-up of the policy commitment, we focused significantly on capacity building. So in 2020, we were able to train almost 8,000 own employees in human rights. Since 2016, about 70,500 employees have been qualified on the topic. The challenges persist. In 2021, the human rights training from March on will be mandatory for all own employees, and that we hope will have a significant change in the numbers. In 2020, a continuous specific training for Vale security teams in accordance to the voluntary principles on security and human rights was carried out for approximately 3,200 employees and contractors, which represents 71% of Vale security workforce. This is done every year and covers all security employees. In terms of risk assessment, since 2012, we do risk assessment and internal due diligence on value operations, but we were based on higher risk operations. We looked into inherited risk by Maplecroft data, the phase of the enterprise, knowing that the implementation phase brought many challenges, line of businesses, and type of operation. Based on this criteria, it's important to say Brumadinho never figured amongst a higher risk operation. After Brumadinho in 2019, alongside value revisions of its governance, health and safety procedures, operational excellency, ombudsman, and risk management, amongst others, human rights was included in Vale's global integrated risk map, and all operations had to do a self-human rights risk assessment, inserting it on Vale's management system, and the human rights area was added as a second line of defense. The first line of defense is always operations, second line of defense, the experts, corporate areas, and third line of defense, auditing, which responds directly to the board. The content follows the risk management governance with reports to the Sustainability Risk Committee and to the Sustainability Committee constituted by members of the board. In terms of due diligence, as Simone mentioned, Vale has defined its methodology and prioritization approach and developed a roadmap to have external due diligence in all operations in a time frame from 3 to 5 years. The management of human rights in our supply chain was also reviewed, and a pilot process was developed in 2020 and being implemented in 2021, including desktop and on-site due diligence based on the criticity or criticality of the suppliers and the contracts they have. The remediation of Brumadinho and support of Samarco remediation, improvement of grievance mechanisms, allegations, treatments, and response, salient issues and stakeholders are also processes that have advanced, and we can explore more during the questions and answers session. For all that, Vale has a dedicated team of 8 experts at corporate level. And we have launched this year the registration of human rights multiplier agents. So we now have around 280 people that are going to be focal points in all our operations as well. We have had an important 10-year path of lessons learned, and we'll never forget Brumadinho and Samarco, and that is making all the difference. Thank you, and I'm open for questions as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for that. That was great. Such an effort to summarize, so much work, over more than 10 years from 2009 in 3 slides. So thank you for that. And I will have a few questions for you when we're done with the presentations. But for now, I would like to highlight one point of that you mentioned in your presentations, that the fact that you did a public consultation when you submitted the policy to external stakeholders so that they could contribute to the new edition, the new version of the policy. And this is something that we often forget. People who undertake human rights due diligence inside corporations. And the message that external consultants try to bring very firmly is that you really have to consider stakeholders in general, internal and external, throughout your processes. And this is really an amazing, it's more than a best practice, it's an amazing practice really to have the general public, external stakeholders able to look at what you have in mind for your policy, or look at the former policy and come up with suggestions for a future one. And also the fact that you have actually considered what people brought to you and included it in the new version of the policy. So I guess this is a highlight that everyone should pay attention to. Before I move on to Natalie from Braskem, I would just like to mention to our participants that you can ask your questions through the Q&A, and they will be asked once we're finished with the presentations and with the first round of questions. So please feel free to Q&A device here at Zoom. So I would like now to move on to Natalie. If you could please, Natalie, share your screen with your presentation. The floor is yours.
So thank you again for the invitation and the opportunity. It is a pleasure and an honor to be sharing this panel with such amazing women on this very relevant day. And for me especially, I'm probably carrying a baby girl, so it's even more special to be speaking about human rights on International Women's Day this year. And it also brings a lot more responsibility. But so to the point, I brought a few slides so I can share my experience with the implementation of the business and human rights agenda at Braskem, where I work as a human rights specialist. So just a brief overview for those of you who are not familiar with our business. Braskem is a Brazilian multinational industry in the petrochemical sector. So here we are in the value chain, first generation, second generation, which are our main products are basic petrochemicals and plastic resins. Derived from either petroleum or ethanol in general, ethanol in the case of the green plastics that we produce. So basically our products are chemicals, plastic resins that serve as raw materials for a number of appliances present in products that we use every day, such as solutions to basic sanitation, health equipment, paints, cleaning products, personal care, packaging, appliances for automobiles, and many, many more. We are a global company founded in Brazil, and we have operations in Mexico, the US, and Germany. However, our market is even broader, as we have suppliers and clients in many more countries than that. So just a brief overview. So now, how is Braskem working on the business and human rights agenda? Let me start. I brought you this timeline. Let me start by focusing on these very important years from 2016 to 2020. We have a much more recent history on working in this issue than Valley. So we started in 2016. And we started implementing the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which it still is our main guidance on the topic. So here I bring a summary of how those initiatives were organized according to the principles when it comes to the responsibility of companies in respecting human rights, okay? So first we see public commitment, which we adopted in 2018 with the approval of our public sustainable development global policy by our board of directors, which is the highest level of the company. This human rights content was also integrated in our codes of conduct, both for team members and third parties. And the second pillar, due diligence, we kicked off our human rights due diligence process in 2016. This was our very first step in this whole process when we developed first here in risk identification and assessment. So we developed this first human rights impact assessment that we concluded in our risk matrix in 2017. And the results were a total of 17 risks mapped and assessed related to human rights. We then prioritized 5 of them and have been managing them with prevention and mitigation measures. We also report them in our sustainability report, which is our annual report, and our website, which you can access in this link. It's important to say that we wouldn't have been able to conduct this process without the support of a consultancy firm with expertise on the subject, because it's a still very unfamiliar topic to the corporate culture. So it was very important to have an external actor to help us. And finally, in the case of an actual violation of any human rights happening, we do have a very strong corporate grievance mechanism called ethics line, but we came to identify that it had a gap when it comes to looking at the victim. So discrimination and harassment were assessed as a high risk. In 2018, we received 70 complaints on this conduct, which represented 20% of the total complaints made in the channel. So in 2019, we started a project. I just wanted to highlight that because it's very recent. It's an advancement. We started a project to assess how we were remediating and supporting those victims. We found that the processes of this mechanism were very clear and strong in establishing and applying disciplinary measures to the aggressor. But the support and remediation measures were decided case by case without any structured guidance, okay? So besides the prevention measures that we have in place for these kinds of violations, we are also now in the process of implementing a number of improvements in the investigation process so as to better care for the victim. So I'd like to come back here a little bit. So I would like to highlight to you the progress that we have been making in regards to the governance and the engagement of the top management in the human rights agenda in those years since 2013, actually. Back in 2013, Brexit approved the map for sustainable development with targets for 2020, okay? So these were 10 sustainability topics with goals and targets. Back then, we had the topic local development as a macro objective, but human rights was not mentioned. And then in 2020, after seven years with the arrival of the reference year 2020, Brexit designed the challenges for the new cycle, 2021-2030. Our team in the Sustainable Development team saw this opportunity to strengthen the governance of the human rights agenda in the process. So the proposal included, for the first time, a macro objective focused on the theme of human rights, which is this one, macro objective 6, social responsibility and human rights. The proposal was constructed in collaboration with many areas and leaders of all regions that we have operations on. And it was approved by the top management, which are the executive committee and the board of directors. So here is a summary of the contents of this macro objective. But first, I like to emphasize that with the process, we succeeded in establishing not only a global company-wide targets related to human rights, but also transversal and integrated governance that involves top management to oversee and monitor those goals. So the governance group, which you can see here in the right, is called Workstream. For this macro objective, the group is sponsored by the Vice President of Sustainable Development, which is in our company in Brazil in general, is a C-level position. As the leader, we have the Sustainable Development Director, and as support, we have the Manager of Social Responsibility and Human Rights. All of these executives participate of the group meetings, and the group has also the participation of approximately 20 leaders and members from all regions, Brazil, Europe, United States, and Mexico, and several areas, so it's very transversal. We have people from sustainable development, of course, human resources, institutional relations, procurement, communication, corporate strategy. So we are very optimistic about this new format of governance, because until now, it was basically led by our small sustainable development team. Regarding very briefly the content of the macro objective, the priority themes defined were local development, equity, and human rights. There is just a clarification that there is a lot of confusion on these, but note that local development is considered a part of a CSR, corporate social responsibility agenda, with projects that promote positive impacts to society. But we need to understand that promoting the advancement of rights, for example, education, health, or employment of certain groups, don't necessarily mean that the company is ensuring that their activities don't have negative impacts on the human rights of others. So there is a difference here, although we are putting them together in the same macro objective. So let's focus on these two. They are more related to the due diligence process that we're talking about. So on diversity and equity, we established the goal to improve the percentage of women in leadership and also of the Black team members. These targets are still under validation. And as to the broad responsibility to respect human rights, we established the goal that by 2030, we manage 100% of all medium and high human rights risks throughout our value chain, which of course includes our own operations. And as a first step for this target, we are updating our human rights impact assessment this year, considering that the original one was done 4 years ago, and it was more focused on Brazil's operation. So just to give you more examples, this is how our human rights risks matrix look like today. The 5 red dots are the risks that were prioritized for management. So you see that among them, there is decent work in the value chain. For example, we have a program to mitigate that. This program tracks and audits, in particular, the practice of our ethanol suppliers, which is a supply chain that is very critical to modern slavery and child labor. And another very critical risks that appear here for the chemical industry in general is health and safety at work. But these were not prioritized because Braskem already has a sound management system in place. So, and this has been a matter of high concern for years to our business. Okay, so just I'm ahead of the time. So just summing up this timeline with some conclusions and insights of my experience in this path, I can say that I could really witness during this process of preparing and validating the macro objective and currently participating of the work stream meetings, I could witness the leap in understanding and awareness of business and human rights by the senior leadership. Just to clarify, all these initiatives and processes I described that were put in place since 2016, they were done through a bottom-up approach by the sustainability teams, specialists, engaging and convincing the top management little by little. We were able to bring light to the importance of the topic, and we finally managed to have the top management buying its governance. We have to keep in mind that for most companies and countries, the UN guiding principles are still voluntary guidelines, and advancements have been made in the past 10 years because of awareness that it is the right thing to do, or because of reputational risks, because investors have been paying attention to social and human rights risks, because clients have been demanding it. And this is true for Braskem as well. And now we have these strong trends of regulation for mandatory due diligence advancing in markets where we operate. Europe, Mexico, possibly the USA will join soon. And we consider all these elements as very important for building our case to the top management. It's noteworthy not only how the top management are more convinced about the importance of these practices, but they have also been the ones demanding more and sponsoring more advancements now, such as the relevance of conducting a due diligence process with a broader scope, the need for more training and awareness building on the topic. In fact, we have been advocating for human rights training to senior leadership for years. And since the work stream was established, they immediately asked for one, which we did in the first meeting of this year. So I think this proves how crucial it is to have the leadership on board and engaged to move forward. And if it's top down, I think it can be a smoother process. Now, one last thought. I think the discussion over the new European regulation shows us that it's only a matter of time until the business and human rights agenda becomes a compliance issue. And I'm optimistic that Braskem is approaching this area of business and human rights regulation and binding instruments more prepared with processes in place and the top management engaged. But we still have many challenges ahead and need more companies on board. So I'm hopeful that the trends on national, regional, international regulation to make the human rights due diligence mandatory are very important to bring the agenda to another level of implementation. Okay, so this is what I'd like to share from our experience, and thanks again for the opportunity. I hope it was helpful. I'm open to any questions you may have. Simone.
Thank you, Natalie. This was a very detailed and inspiring presentation. I will keep some of the topics that you mentioned in your presentation to my questions, but I'd like to highlight for now that you at some point mentioned a deeper, thorough look into remediation. And I think this is worthy mentioning because when we talk about legislation, and this is currently being discussed in Europe also, we are looking more and more to civil liability. So it's either you remediate with your own means, whereas you can still do it without anybody else telling you to, or you may face, I'm talking about a hypothetical future when norms and legislation will be in place. But you either deal with your alleged violations, or you risk facing civil liability further on. So I think this is something that companies also should start to consider in terms of the incorporation of human rights, but also that part of the guiding principles that we usually say is the weakest one, which is the remediation part. So I'm going to move on to a few questions that I have for you guys. So I have one question for Natalie and Lizo concerning high-level engagement, something that you both have mentioned in terms of how do you bring the top-level management, top management level, better saying, on the board and have them buy into your work and into the implementation of the business and human rights agenda in the corporation with all it takes, because you have both made it very clear that it's lengthy, it's complex, it's deep, and you deal with a number of areas of the company. So my question to you and Lizo is, how did you both manage to engage the top management of the company to, for instance, approve a policy or to define global targets and so forth? And to Raquel, the question I have is, I know that it's still a nascent discussion, and as we move on in 2021, and we'll see more of what's going to come up in Europe in terms of the directive that is being drafted. But could you share a piece of advice? You are in Europe, you work a lot with European companies. Could you share a piece of advice with the companies watching us here today on how to prepare or what they should be worried about in terms of this legislation in Europe? So I'll start with Lizo on the leadership question, please.
Well, I think it's extremely important that board level and C-level are involved in the human rights agenda. This is part today of Vale's statute, which determines that human rights is part of the role of the board. It also follows governance for the risk assessment, as I mentioned. So that has been inserted and respond up to the C-level and the board. And one thing that I believe it's worth mentioning, last year we were able to do 2 webinars with Professor John Ruggie, one with board and C-level personnel, and the other with the leadership and staff of areas related to the topic of human rights. And that was extremely positive and place the topic on another level.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Lisa, very much appreciated. Natalie, could you please share your view on that?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a resilience exercise. We take it little by little, and I think it's important. I mean, as human rights advocates, we usually bring a very human rights centered discourse. I think it's important to adapt it to a corporate language. So as I mentioned, we pack up many different arguments. Not only is the right thing to do, okay, right, to respect human rights of others, but it can also cause reputational risks to your company. Investors have been paying attention to it. The ESG movement is there. We're looking at social and human rights risks, and the clients have been demanding it. If you have a global operation with clients abroad, well, we have a lot of European clients, so they have been asking about our practices in the supply chain mainly. So all these elements that are more connected to the business help us build the case to the top management. So they are convinced that this is not just a corporate responsibility matter, but it will soon become a matter of compliance, and the trends of regulation come that way. But yeah, if it's the top management is not engaged from the beginning, it's a lengthier path, and you have to come up with strategies and good practices to, to be successful and bring in their attention.
Yes, thank you. So what I hear from you both is that you really have to have a multifold strategy in terms of leadership engagement. But again, we couldn't emphasize enough how critical that is for a due diligence process to actually be successfully implemented. Raquel, so my question to you, repeating, is what piece of advice would you give to companies that are looking ahead to the implementation of this new legislation in Europe?
Yes, so it's not clear in terms of the scope of the directive, whether it's going to apply only for companies that are based in Europe, or whether it might apply also to companies that are outside Europe but also operate in Europe somehow. So this is one of the questions that was part of the consultation that would just happen. So we don't really know that, but for sure, I think 2 things, right? So the companies that might fall under the scope of the directive, to be better prepared for that, they should really align their processes to the guiding principles, right? We don't know exactly the level of detail of the directive, and we don't know the level of detail of the laws that are going to be developed based on the directive. But for sure, the directive, all the communications from the Commission, the Parliament mentions alignment to the UN guiding principles. And all the companies that might be part of value chains, or even investee companies from investors in Europe, they should understand that they're going to also be reached out at some point to answer questions, because these companies will need to conduct due diligence. So they should also consider the guiding principles, looking into their high-risk operations and how they could address potential issues and apply due diligence.
Yes, Thank you. I have two questions from the audience. One is directed to Lizo from Raquel Pinto, and the question is, first, she congratulates you guys for the presentations, and she'd like to hear from Lizo about the complaint and denunciation mechanism. So the grievance mechanisms, Lizo, if you could give more detail on that, on your experience. And then there's a second question about risk mapping that I will address to Raquel, since she's an expert on risk, human rights risks in corporations. So the question is, the person, I don't have the name, but he or she also congratulates the panel for the presentation. And she or he asks, could you please explain the difference of a human rights risk mapping and a full due diligence? So I would start with Lizo, please, on your grievance mechanisms.
Okay, well, the first thing to say is that grievance mechanisms for us is at the heart of not only the remediation aspect of it, but the prevention of human rights violations. So the sooner you know of an impact you have generated on a community, the sooner you can resolve the problem and avoid an escalation of the problem. So Vale, do you want to say anything, Simone? No. Okay, you made a gesture. So grievance mechanisms are extremely strategic. We have at Valley many different channels, and what we are working in the last years is to centralize all this information worldwide and to be able to access the grievances, the time of response, the resolution, and we hope to advance into satisfaction as well. The grievance mechanisms at site level, they are very dependent on community relations teams. And because usually people and communities, they'd rather have a face-to-face interaction, and now we have also a mobile possibility of interaction as well because of COVID, of course, but a face-to-face interaction instead of just contact us or a channel through a site. But you need to have different channels to be able to reach all stakeholders, different stakeholders, but for community relations, teams are extremely strategic. And having a centralized system that you can manage, you can understand what the grievances are, you can manage the response time, the effectiveness of the channel, and also hopefully move into satisfaction is strategic. We work with those channels and with our grievance mechanisms, and this year we are expanding that to different countries to be able to have this centralized management approach.
Thank you, Lizo. Raquel, if you could please respond the question about the risk versus the full due diligence process, please.
Yeah, sure. So I try to make it simple, actually, just in terms of explaining the process. So actually, risk assessment is part of the diligence. So we say that the diligence should be risk-based, meaning that we have to start with a risk assessment, understand actually where we have highest risk, and make sure that we implement the measures to mitigate these risks and that we monitor the effectiveness. So due diligence would be the whole process, including the measures and checking effectiveness. In a nutshell.
Well, congratulations for the summary. That's really hard to do. So I have another question from the audience to Lizo and Natalie from Marie de Mesidor. Could you please bring examples by which human rights policies achievements to mitigate risks have been used in other areas of your firm? For example, marketing department to have impact on consumers.
Okay, well, for us, we are a business-to-business company, so we sell to other companies. We don't have this relation with end consumers because iron ore nickel, etc. They are part of end products, but they are not directly our focus on the business relations. So I have a little bit of difficulty responding to this, and I think maybe Bruce can talk about that.
Natalie, if you would like to, I will repeat the question for you. So can you bring examples by which human rights policies achievements to mitigate risks have been used in other areas of your firm, for example, marketing department, to have positive impact on consumers?
Yeah, I'm in the same situation. We are a B2B company, but what I can think about saying to respond more or less this question is that, well, in the policy, it's a sustainable development policy, which makes it more transversal, and the human rights content is in there. We consider, for instance, our economy, our circular economy problem and challenge, which are plastics in the environment. We also consider it a human rights issue. So, and this affects society as a whole, even though we don't have direct customers, we have clients. So I'm not saying anything about marketing, but this is a way of looking at the commitment as affecting other areas. Circular economy is not in our sustainable development area, but the human rights approach is integrated in this challenge as well. Same as with anti-corruption, we have a human rights approach to this area and topic.
Yeah, I think I can.
Can I compliment? Sorry, Simone. Our clients are more and more concerned about, and it has everything to do with what Raquel brought in terms of the risks in the supply chain. So it's not going to translate too much into end consumer, but it will translate in clients and clients of clients. So motor vehicle builders that are concerned of the raw materials, where they're coming from, and if there are risk assessments and impacts being generated in the supply chain. So I think that would be more the approach that ourselves and probably Bruscan would have to follow in terms of guaranteeing that the risk management due diligence are taking care of risks and impacts on human rights in our processes, activities, to diminish risks for the clients.
Yeah, I would just add one little point about this, Mahi, is that risks is something that you're not supposed to, you have to deal with it. So it won't become a problem. Once it becomes a problem, you have badly managed your risk. So it's something that you deal with internally, and you establish your controls, and some controls also implicate other agents from society. But what I would like to say is that you can actually turn your risk into opportunity. So for instance, if you are facing a risk for which you can not only control, but do something positive about, then you're actually transforming that risk into an opportunity. I think that applies to consumers, and I think that applies also to local stakeholders. When you see you have a risk of infringing one right or another, water, for instance, access to water in mining, very common. You can not only deal with the risk of impacting water, but you can also work and support the communities or the public system to improve access to water. This is beyond risk management, but this is really dealing with your risk and making something positive of it, just to add one point to what was already shared. I have a question from the audience to Liesl. Lizo, could you talk about human rights in the mining sector in Brazil with focus on improvements?
On improvements, okay. I think the Brumadinho tragedy has changed significantly the scenario for mining in Brazil, but also coming from international operations like ICMM and the new tailings, global tailings review that became the tailings standard. So this, both internationally and in Brazil, legislation has evolved. Community engagement has been prioritized. Risk assessment, due diligence, not yet in the legislation, but already being demanded by investors, by creditors, by especially ESG investors. We will have another panel on that. So I think Brazil, in terms of the guiding principles, there is a lot of effort from many different partners, including Global Compact, on capacity building and advancing this agenda. But I think we have a long way to go for Brazilian companies. I think most international companies that operate in Brazil, they do have a policy, they do follow the guiding principles. But in terms of Brazilian companies, I think there is still a gap to be filled. But I think, especially in the mining sector, a lot has evolved, still a long way to go, but already improvements in terms of demands, scrutiny, social scrutiny on that, NGOs, attentions and pressure, and community pressure, and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you, Lizo. Well, we only have 2 minutes left, unfortunately. So I'm going to say some closing remarks. I will start by thanking the Brazil-Canada Chamber of Commerce for putting together this presentation, thanking Proachiva also to have brought all of us together. And thank you for the panelists, obviously. It was a great discussion. As usual, I didn't expect less than that. As I said, and I say it again for the audience, you heard some of the people that have been dealing with the diligence in Brazil, and in the case of Raquel in Brazil and elsewhere, for the longest. I mean, you're talking to some of the Brazilian people who have been doing this, who are pioneers, as I mentioned when I introduced Lizo earlier on. So I guess one important point that that I could take from all of your presentations is that the demand now that's becoming a matter of liability is really, as we say, to walk the talk. So not only you have to have a policy, you have to disseminate it internally massively, or even become it mandatory, as Lizo said, will be the case in Vale, for people to really stop and listen to the human rights trainings and so forth. Then you have to think about the heart of the due diligence, the risk assessment, impact assessments that we haven't managed much, we haven't mentioned much today, but they're very, they're heavy, cumbersome processes that have to be established also, in particular for those areas, those industries, and mining is one of them, that have the, they're prone to social environmental impact. So not only risk assessment inserted in the process of the company, so you don't have something running on the side, which is more, it's also feasible. It depends on the size of the company and what you expect to achieve. But just as long as you make sure you have a human rights inserted in the risk processes, in the risk tools, methodologies, and so forth. Then you have the on the ground work of the impact assessments. You have to be able to monitor everything that comes out of it. They have to become plans of action, and they have to be monitored. And then you have to report about it. Some companies in the world already have exclusive human rights reports. And then to support all of that, you really have to have a very robust grievance mechanism. As Lizo said, this is the entry door for risk assessment and to remediation. So you can remedy a problem if it's already there, or you can avoid it from happening via making it sometimes becoming a risk and dealing with it, or if it's just a one-off case, dealing with that one-off case straight away. I don't want to discourage the people in the audience that weren't familiar with the due diligence processes or with the incorporation of the UN Guiding Principles into their processes. But the bottom line is, it's a process that if you haven't started, and if you think your company will somehow be impacted by the European legislation, then it's something that you really have to look at quite swiftly. Because the guiding principles, as was said, I think by Raquel, it's the basis on which all the norms and legislations that are being built throughout the world, be them focused in slave labor or in child labor or in value chain, and now in Europe, a broader one, as we already have actually in France also, they will necessarily request at least what the guiding principles suggest. So have a good look at the guiding principles. There are a number of very, very numerous pieces of literature explaining the principles and examples of their implementation. And it's quite a fascinating journey, as I think we all understood from our panelists. So good luck with that. And I guess I will end now, thanking again Carolina and Dulce and my dear colleagues here with me this afternoon. Thank you very much. Carolina, I don't know if you want to say any closing remarks, or Dulce.
Thank you very much, Simone, for moderating this incredible panel. It's a very interesting subject. I'm fascinated by it. So thanks for clarifying a lot of questions that we had. Natalie, Raquel, Lizo, thank you very much for finding some time from your busy agenda to be here with us today. And we hope to continue engaging with you guys this year to bring more discussions on human rights to this forum as well.